All right, I have started the recording. All right, first of all, I want to welcome everybody. This is my first raid lead discussion for a specific trial, and Veteran Mauve Lurkage was requested. Veteran Mauve Lurkage was the first DLC trial that came out. It was linked to the Thieves Guild, and it has a lot of achievements in it. It was the first trial that ZOS put out that actually gave you achievements for trash fights. And it was also, technically, the first trial that required 2 tanks for each boss fight. Now, you could certainly say that Sanctum Ophidia also required 2 tanks for at least the Serpent fight, and it helped with Ozara. It also helped with Manticora. But Veteran Mauve Lurkage actually required 2 tanks based on specific boss mechanics. So what I'm going to do is break it down into 3 sections. The first section I'm going to talk about is pre-trial. It's everything that I do as a raid leader when I'm trying to put together a team to run Veteran Mauve Lurkage. The middle part, second part, is going to be discussing trial specifics. And this will include boss health, it will include DPS benchmarks, it will also include specific mechanics and pitfalls that a lot of new raid leaders will fall into as they're trying to learn this trial. The last part of the discussion is going to be pretty brief. It's just going to go over what I review after the trial is done. The speed run cutoff time limit for Veteran Mauve Lurkage is 40 minutes. And it's definitely doable today. Back when the trial first came out, that was a significant achievement. And once I go through the DPS benchmarks, you'll understand why. So for pre-trial setups, the first thing you have to do as a raid lead is you have to determine, is this going to be an open run or is this going to be a team run? Because you have to kind of have a different mindset depending on which direction you go. Obviously, for both open and team run, you need to lay out team positions. You also have to take a look at your composition. You need to make sure that you have 2 tanks. You may need to make sure you have 2 healers and 8 DPS. Ideally, you'd want 4 melee and 4 range DPS. However, you can have more range DPS. It's just on the first fight. You will need range people to be in melee positions if you run a heavy range group. You also, specifically for TBC, if you decide you're going to run an open Veteran Mauve Lurkage, you need to define what your minimum level of expertise is. The trial was designed for CP 300, so obviously you want your players to have at least 300 CP. Has it been done with less CP? Yeah, but it's definitely much more of a struggle. And it's more of a struggle in the end, not necessarily on DPS, but on resistances and specifically CP in the red tree. And some also in the green tree as far as regeneration. For your support roles, which include your 2 tanks and your 2 healers, my suggestion is if you're going to run an open at TBC, you need at least 1 tank and 1 healer that are very skilled and understand mechanics of this trial. The skill level between Craglorns and the DLCs is pretty significant as far as the difference. So you want to make sure that at least half your support role people are going to be knowledgeable about this trial. If you try and take 2 brand new tanks in there, you're going to struggle. You're going to struggle mightily, because this is also a trial which started the trend of putting a lot more responsibility on the shoulder of the tanks and healers. It also is determined by your own personal comfort level with the mechanics. Regardless of what position you're in, whether you're running as a tank, a healer, or a DPS, you have to be able to anticipate the mechanics that are coming up. You know, when you're on Jahasa, you have to know what the benchmarks are for shield phase. You have to know, what the pillars do. You have to be able to talk your team through it, so you have to have a fairly high degree of comfort when taking 11 other people through. When you post in TBC, you want to make sure that you tag the appropriate groups. And by appropriate groups, I would say definitely adepts in the guild. are qualified to go into a vMOL locage. Journeymen, by and large, are usually at a point where they can also go into vMOL locage. I think where you have to be a bit selective is with our apprentices. Now, if you have an apprentice who will say a transfer from console, and the only reason they're an apprentice is because lack of exposure to the trials on PC and low CP, then that's one thing, because at least they're familiar with mechanics, you would hope, versus someone who's brand new to trialing altogether. If you are unsure about mechanics or you're not sure how TBC calls, you're more than welcome to put a run together and have the GMs come with you. Jen and I have been running vMOL locage ever since it hit PTS. Our group that we put together was one of the first groups on the North American server to actually clear Jahasa on PTS. It was an interesting trial on PTS as well, because I think there was only one group maybe that made it to Rakat. And so consequently, after that trial, they made it so that you could actually experience the other trial bosses. The way they had set it up on PTS is you had to progress through it just like you would, on live. And so they didn't get a whole lot of feedback on a lot of the boss fights down the road. Once you post your roster, you also want to obviously list what time you're running. All of our times are listed Eastern Standard Time. You want people to sign up. And also with an open run, you want to find out who knows what. So when you have people sign up, have them list their experience, what they, how far have they gotten in that particular trial, and, your cutoff time, how long are you going to run. If you're posting for a team, it's a little bit different. And part of that is because you're more familiar with the people that you're running with. You've already handpicked them. And so instead of a sign up, it's more of a roster posting and position assignment. So first thing I'm going to do.
I was going to say one thing too for doing an open, make sure they're posting their role as well, because you will need to know that, whether or not they're melee or ranged, because that will affect where you put people.
Yeah, I was getting to that because I was going to post a diagram and discuss that.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, bear with me because we don't have that position diagram in here, do we? Yeah, we do. Okay.
Yeah, it's there.
Okay, so the first diagram that I'm actually bringing up, I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but this goes into posting your roster and assigning positions. When the trial first came out, there were multiple ways people would position the tanks and healers and DPS. There were times when we would have tanks that actually would position on pad 3. There were times when we would have people, tanks position on the exit door. I mean, it was crazy. We had tanks positioning everywhere, trying to figure out the best configuration based on the mechanics of the fight. Normally how we post is, we'll obviously post our 2 tank positions, our 2 healer positions, and then we divide up our DPS into our melee positions and then into our ranged positions. The diagram is usually posted with the roster so people know what their position number is. So it's real important that when you do post, and even for a team run, you want to post what position number they are for the first fight. Healer positions are also posted here as well. And like I said, you can have more range people. In other words, if you're only running with 2 melee, but you have 6 range, that's fine. You can just slot those 2 range people into 2 melee positions, and they'll be able to DPS from there. The reason that we have a diagram such as this is because of the mechanics of that particular fight, which I'll go over in a minute. But it gives them an idea of where they're supposed to be slotted. The nice thing about this, especially for a team run, is, I know Jen does this, I do this as well. When I'm running my team in vMOL, I put everybody in the same positions every week. And even though from week to week they know what position they're in, it's still nice to see that on the roster. They get really comfortable with it and familiar. They know who is on their left and who is on their right, who is behind them. And so it just makes setting up for that fight much more efficient.
Can I add something on that?
Okay.
I was just going to say that if you end up having a bunch of subs, or have a couple of subs or whatever, if some of your team can't make it, I still try and keep my regulars in their regular positions, and then I slot the the people who are subbing into the people who are gone positions,
Right.
just to make it easier on the people that are there, so they're in their same position that they normally would be in. Once in a while, you have to switch it around. And if you do that, just make sure you talk to your regular team member and say, "Look, I had to move you over to position X just for tonight." Um, it kind of helps, and that's a reminder for them, because we've actually had it where we switched someone around and we ended up having a little bit of a problem because they didn't realize they were in a different position. So it's always good to tell them if you're going to move them. If they're a regular team member, say, "I have you in position 2 instead of position 1 tonight."
Okay, so that segues into starting the trial. Actually, normally in the beginning, when everybody is gathered where the merchants are and where the crafting tables are at the entrance of the trial, I usually will go over position assignments again. If it's an open run, I also am very, very clear with everyone there. And especially when they sign up, they know ahead of time if this is a speed run, if this is a training run. And I also will discuss my expectations. For example, if this is a training run and we have a brand new tank, everyone knows that, because I don't want them signing up for something thinking, oh, it's a farm run, when in fact we may not even clear. So that's very, very important in raid leading. Very important is outlining your expectations and the goals and making sure everyone knows that. Now, if you post it in your roster and you come in and you discuss it and you still have someone that gets torqued off because I thought this was a farm run, that's on them. That's not on you. You've given them all the information. It's not your fault that they didn't read the roster or they didn't listen in the beginning. So just keep that in mind as well. When we're gathered up in the entry area and we're talking about positioning, I sometimes will do a mock stack where I will have everyone get into position relative to one of the tanks being the boss or a statue or whatever, even a cake. And that way it kind of gets everybody on the same page, especially people who've never run together. It's kind of hard when you're looking at name bars and you're not quite sure who is who, but doing a mock stack beforehand takes a lot of the guesswork out, and again, increases your efficiency of getting set up on the first boss fight. As I said, I do discuss the goals of the run, but I also will remind them of priority targets. A lot of the discussion that you have with them before you even start the trial is dependent upon the level of expertise that your raiders have with this particular trial. If I'm going in there with my team, there ain't no discussion, there ain't no, mock stack or anything, because they've been in there with me enough, they know what's expected. With an open group, it's a totally different thing. And even with some team runs, it's different. If it's a team that hasn't ever been in there before, obviously you want to go through a little bit of prep work ahead of time. Or if it's a team that's struggling, a lot of times getting your thoughts and getting your goals and your what you're trying to accomplish outlined up front puts everybody on the same page. And it makes people feel secure and safe that you've got things organized. At that point, I make sure everybody understands their positions. I make sure everybody understands what the goal is. And then I tell them, reiterate, priority targets. This is mostly for trash. We're going to have trash prior to the first boss. And there's a specific way that TPC will pull that trash. Part of that is, trial and error. Like I said, we've been doing this trial for 3.5 years. And we found a way that works best for us. Is it the fastest? No. Can we get speed runs? We do all the time. It's not the most aggressive. It's fairly conservative, but that's kind of how we run. And part of the philosophy behind that is Jen and I hate chaos. And we're not going to have a group unless I'm guaranteed that the entire group is going to be able to survive this. We're not going to run through that first or the second door up to the top of the stairs and pull both groups of trash ads. We're just not. Because, unless we're secure in the fact that we know you guys are going to pump out 85k DPS per person and stay alive, there's just no point. It doesn't save any time because you've got people dying all over the place. So we minimize deaths up front, maximizes efficiency throughout the run. So for trash,
efficiency.
Yep. So for trash, when you first go through the door, I'm pulling up the first diagram, you're going to have three trash mobs. You're going to have what's called a sun eater, which is a mage like two-legged cat in a dress. The sun eater is the first priority, and the reason is for two things. Number one, she does these black balls on the ground, and the further away from her you are, the harder they hit. But the biggest issue is a mechanic called a negate. She will randomly target someone in the group, and she will drop this very large AoE circle that will slow you, and it will kill you. So that's why she is a priority. The next two ads that spawn on that first trash pack are an archer and a one-handed shield. From my purposes, I always prioritize archers second. And the reason is they do an arrow spray that puts a bleed on people, which can be purged. Okay, so one thing you can counsel your healers is to have a purge for the trash, just because there are people who will get caught in that arrow spray. And the bleed damage can be significant if they get hit more than once.
Or if they're shattered.
You will not. Now, that's something else. Yeah, you're not going to be shattered in this first group of trash, because the ad that does the shatter is a two-hander, which is not here. The one-handed shield is usually pulled over to the archer and stacked on the archer. After everybody kills the mage, they come over and they cleave the archer and the one-handed shield. Then we pass through the first door. When you pass through that first door, just be mindful that when you go up the stairs, it triggers the next event. And the next event, you'll have essentially a mage to the right at an archway. You'll have a bunch of small ads. A one-handed shield will spawn on the ramp, and then you'll have two archers at the top of the ramp. Normally at this point in time, we split up the tanks, and one tank will grab the one-handed shield. Another tank will go up the ramp ahead of everyone and taunt both archers, taking them back to this back arch at the top and stacking them. The mage occasionally will target that tank, and she'll end up running up the ramp. There's a 1 in 12 chance that she will target that far tank and decide she's going to come upstairs. And there's not really anything you can do about that. You just follow her and kill her.
And whine about your dots. Oh, my dots.
Yep. I'm going to stop right here, because there is one thing in prep that I did not cover that's really important. And that is making sure that you have coordinated with your healers and your tanks their gear and what they're wearing. Right now, the meta tank set is Yolnahkrin and Alkosh. That's a great set for your main tank. You can actually put Alkosh on your off tank as well, because your off tank is handling different ads. So that's just something to keep in mind. You can pair that with Torgs, you can pair it with Dragon, you can pair it pretty much with anything you like. For healers, it's a little bit different. A lot of healers are now going to Eben. And part of the reason for that is because of strats like this, where your tanks are separated from your group. Your healer is going to be relatively in the stack so that they get that buff to their health from the Eben set. Another set, obviously, that is a meta set for healers right now is Olorime. So you want to make sure at least one of your healers is in Olorime. Other sets that people have used in here, Sanctuary, Mending, IA, Worm, they're okay. I don't necessarily think I would go with Sanctuary or even Mending on these trash fights, simply because the AoE effect area is so small. Other sets that I would actually prioritize would be Worm, Herseens, IA, not necessarily if you're running with a Warden. The Warden skill Swarm was changed, and Minor Vulnerability was added to that. So IA isn't necessarily a set that you would need if you're running a Warden healer, a Warden DPS, or even a Warden tank. So, alright, back to trash. So this first set of trash we've cleared. The second set, we've pulled the two archers, the one-handed shields brought up, and we clear all of that. The last set of trash before this boss, there have been multiple ways to stack this trash and pull. The thing you have to be mindful of is there is a new ad, a two-hander, called a Savage. The Savage does a shatter. The interesting thing about the shatter is it's not a cone. It's more of an AoE around the actual mob. So if you have melee that are all up in his business, they are going to be shattered. Now, if you have a tank who understands mechanics, they can actually call out when a shatter is coming, and it's timing based. Fel Tank, who tanks for me on caffeines, he's actually really good at being able to call out shatters coming, and so my melee will peel off. If a melee is shattered, they need to call out so the healers can keep them healed, because if they take any additional damage, they'll die. So it's easy to just pull that two-hander off. Normally, he's pulled off towards that back arch and just kind of held there. You'll need to have a healer kind of pay attention to that tank, especially if the tank is eating the shatters and eating the heavies. What I will do is I will taunt the archers, there's 2 of them, and the one-handed shield, and I will run back to where this pillar is. And what that does is it stacks those archers up nice together here, and it turns their spray away from the group that's focusing on that Sun Eater in that bottom left corner. All right, so that's pretty much the first trash pull prior to the first boss. Have to keep an eye on my time here. All right, so first boss, Jahasa. He has 46.5 million health. And I did some calculations. And my calculations are that if you want this fight to be over in 4 minutes, your DPS have to average 24k per person. And that's just 8 DPS. That doesn't take into account, you know, the minimal DPS done by healers or tanks. But that's 24 per damage dealer to complete the fight in 4 minutes. For 3 minutes, it has to be around 32k. And for a 2-minute fight, your 8 DPS will have to average 48k. There is a specific mechanic to this fight. I'm going to pull up the positioning chart because you can see one of them, where you have these cleanse pads. These cleanse pads, when taken, respawn every 25 seconds. Now, as I said, this diagram is designed this way for a specific mechanic, and that mechanic is the boss will throw out 3 curses to random people in the group. It could be a tank, it could be a healer, it could be damage dealers. But 3 curses will go out. The timing of it, I think, is actually related to boss health and time. We haven't really drilled down deep, but regardless, we do know that he will put curses out right after shield phase. He will put curses out right after pillars.
We
after
used
they go
to know
out.
that information. I'll have to look for it.
I don't really think at this point it's absolutely necessary to know, because if your damage dealers and your healers and your tanks are maintaining their positions, it's not going to matter. Now, the reason I bring up that spawn time for the cleanse pad is because when you get cursed, 2 things happen. 1, you start to become slowed, and 2, for the first 2 seconds you're cursed, you are contagious. The reason we have this diagram in this kind of position and formation is because what that does is it allows the damage dealers, if they maintain their position, if they get cursed and they wait 2 seconds, they will not infect their neighbors. This is not like poison spreading in SO. This is 10 times worse. You only have 6 cleanse pads. Now, if you think about it, okay, so there's 6 cleanse pads, 3 people get cursed, then there's plenty of cleanse pads for people to cleanse. And that's true. However, the timer on the curse is 19 seconds. So if people are spreading curses, you're not going to have enough cleanse pads, and you're going to have people die. The longer the curse stays on, the slower you become. The idea is, as soon as someone's cursed, their screen turns blue. After 2 seconds passes, they can then go to a cleanse pad. Some DPS will stay in the stack and wait, and they'll DPS until it's the last possible minute. They do not want to do that because, again, those cleanse pads are on a timer. So the next set of curses, you want the cleanse pads to be available. As soon as you're cursed, you wait 2 seconds, you go to a cleanse pad. This leads me to pitfalls for this particular fight. And one of those pitfalls is segregating cleanse pads designated for healers and tanks only. And here's why that's a pitfall. Because that takes 2 cleanse pads out of the mix. So you only have 4 that the damage dealers can take. If in 2 successive curses he only hits damage dealers, you're going to have people die unnecessarily. Your tanks and your healers usually will take pad 6 or 1, and that's just because of proximity, and that's fine. But if a tank or a healer's not cursed, there's no reason why they can't take that pad. If a tank or a healer gets cursed, the way we do it in TBC is they call out tank cursed, healer cursed, so that the group knows that a tank and or a healer are going to take those pads. If a tank isn't cursed, a healer isn't cursed, those pads are up for grabs. Now, last week I talked about the pillars of raid leading, and the last one being trust. This is where a lot of trust comes in. You're trusting your tanks and your healers to call out when they're cursed. You're also trusting your damage dealers not to spread the curse. And you're trusting your damage dealers to get to the pads quickly, cleanse, and get back in the stack. Another pitfall. You'll have a damage dealer look up and look around, and there's not a cleanse pad that's lit up. Oh, I can't go take it. I'm just going to die in stack. Wrong. Those cleanse pads have a timer, and if they're running Raid Notifier, which is a required add-on for TBC raids, there is a diagram that will give you a countdown on when that cleanse pad is going to come back up. If there's a cleanse pad with less than 17 seconds to come back up, they need to get their ass to the pad, they need to park it, and they need to shield up and DPS from the pad. Now, one thing to keep in mind is if they get targeted by a pillar, that's going to put a pillar pretty far out. One thing they can do when they're on that pad is they can hold block when that pillar comes at them. And there are a couple of pads that occasionally the pillar would literally bounce away from the person and not even come up on the pad. The reason I say they need to park the pad and not stand next to it is because sometimes those pads come up at the last absolute minute. Literally, you are paralyzed when it comes up and cleanses you. If you're paralyzed on the side of the pad, you can't cleanse, and you're going to die literally standing next to it. Honestly, if everyone is maintaining position, if you have to have people park a pad, you're only going to have 1 or 2 park at any given time. 1 or 2 pillars is not a big deal that far out. We start the fight with a center stack, and that's to hopefully have a center pillar placed so that people don't have to move too far to get away to get behind it. The thing to keep in mind with center stack is if the pillar spawns on the tank, chances are that pillar is no good. And if you try and stand behind it during the explosion phase, you'll probably end up dying. We're not sure why that happens. It's obviously a bug, but it's one that they have chosen not to address. So just be mindful that if the pillar spawns on the tank, don't use it. So 2 pitfalls. Not using all the pads available when a tank or a healer is not cursed. And 2, not parking a pad. Those 2 problems seem to be the most prevalent for raid leaders leading on this particular boss. As I mentioned earlier, there's shield phase. He puts a shield up around him that must be DPS down at 70% boss health and 30% boss health. Back in the day, we actually used to drop a Nova because it does a room-wide AoE pulse. And everyone takes damage. The reason the healers are positioned where they are is because they can hit everyone with combat prayer, they can drop an illustrious healing circle, they can get their orbs and shards out, and it will pretty much cover the room. One of the caveats to parking a pad is if you're going into shield phase. I generally will tell my damage dealers, keep a shield on your back bar, because if you happen to get stuck on a cleanse pad during shield phase, you're going to be out of the AoE heals. And so you want to shield up and block and pray the pad comes up so you can get back in the stack. This positioning is also for the shield phase because during the shield phase, everyone will have a pulsing AoE circle under their feet. Now that circle can cross over someone else's circle. However, it can't cross over that person's feet. So if they're standing too close together and the circles are overlapping to the point where they're actually touching their neighbor's feet, both of those people are going to take double damage and they'll die. This fight is all about positioning. It really is. And damage dealers and tanks and healers who have ants in their pants and can't stand still, this is a very difficult fight. Your melee people have to be able to be comfortable standing stock still and not bouncing around, not moving forward, backwards, or in between. So that's also something to emphasize with the group. The last pitfall that I find that raid leaders have with this particular fight are the cats. Since they made the change to CC immunity, it's gotten a lot more difficult. The cats will put a bleed on people. And when you chain them in and talons them, when that talons wears off, you cannot talons them again. Even the chains themselves will make them immune. And it is a pain in the ass. So the idea is for them to die to cleave as quick as possible. And your OT's got to be fast. Now, sometimes the MT will chain in as well. If the OT is parked on a cleanse pad, there's not a whole hell of a lot they can do. The idea, and this is more for healers than anything else, you guys are more mobile. And so the healers will a lot of times try and they'll attract the cats too. They got catnip in their pockets. They'll bring the cats into the tanks. And the idea is at that point, when those cats are there, if people have ultimates, that's when they need to drop them. Don't have them drop ultis on the shield. You cannot crit a shield. So they should just DPS like normal.
You can crit a shield.
When did that change?
2 patches ago.
Really?
Patch or 2 ago. It was a big deal in PvP, but it also made the first boss vMOL easier.
That's interesting. Okay. Well, then I stand corrected.
Yeah. Well, it used to crit, then it didn't crit, so
Yeah.
apparently we're back to crit.
Yeah.
So who knows with us?
Yeah. But this again is just
It's good to know, though.
It is good to know. That is real good to know. One last thing on this particular fight, as far as horn calling, you want to rotate your horns and keep them up as much as possible. So make sure that you've got a horn tracker of some type so that you can watch it and you can make sure you're calling your horns. Now, it all depends on the group. Sometimes raid leaders are comfortable with tanks and healers doing their own horns. I mean, that's fine. We use HODO reflexes so that you can, the raid lead can keep an eye on, who has what horn and what's up. But you want to make sure that you've got your horns going out regularly. And it's super, super important. You want to keep that burn on the boss going at all times, including pillar phase. When you're behind the pillar, you could still damage the boss. So when your DPS are stacked behind a pillar waiting for the room explosion, they need to still be putting dots and damage on the boss. You can DPS through that. Tanks, if you get your timing down right, you can actually roll dodge out from behind the pillar early. Again, you've got to have your timing down, but you can do it, and that's imperative because that keeps the boss in the same position and he's not flying all over the place. There is a point at the end of the fight where he'll put his last set of curses out, and I've made calls multiple times for people to stay in. And that would be the only time I would tell people not to go to the cleanse pads, and that's just because we're so close to him dying that I know my group DPS and will be able to kill him before anybody dies to curse. All of that is timing, and all of that comes with experience and cycles through here. So just make sure that, as you learn this, pay attention to the timing. Go back through and see how long it takes you to complete the fight. Watch streams and see where your people are positioned. If you have people that are out of position constantly, make sure that you're correcting them during the fight, so that they're not constantly spreading curses. So that's pretty much the first boss fight. Let me make sure I have everything here covered. Cats do come out on the even percentages. So they'll come out at 80, 60, 40, and 20. And there will be successively more cats each time they spawn. The explosion mechanism, make sure that you know how many pillars are out as the raid lead. The first explosion happens after the 5th pillar spawns. You need to call out to your team to get behind a pillar, and they need to make sure that as they're looking through the pillar, the boss is completely, covered, essentially. He's not sticking out either side of the pillar. You have to be at that particular angle so that when he does the explosion, that pillar will block that explosion from killing you. you can actually see him through the pillar. They're translucent. But you want to make sure that all you see is the blue image of him and not him himself sticking out either side.
Do you want to go over the pattern of the pillars?
Yeah, I mean, back in the day, it was
5-5,
it
4-4.
was way more important because our DPS as a group was a lot lower. But each successive pillar spawn set spawns one less pillar. So it does have a hard enrage mechanic where you can, if your DPS is low enough, get to the point where you have one pillar that spawns, and then after that, the next, we have no pillars that spawn, and he'll just explode the room. But
they come out in twos. They start at 5. There's two
sets of 5, two sets of 4, two sets of 3, 2 3, 2, and 1. We haven't gotten to 2 sets of 1 and
since the PTS
3 years.
Practically. Yeah,
but still, it's just nice to know that each successive set of pillars is, you've got 2 sets of 5, and if your DPS is really low, you've got a training group, you've got a lot of people dying, you are going to get to successive fewer and fewer pillars, and placement of them is going to matter. He generally will target the furthest person out and send the pillar out there. So if you have a lot of people that are, spreading curses and waiting on pads to cleanse, you're going to have a lot of pillars way far out. Another thing that happens, and this is in a newbie group, is your range people will drift backwards. And I think part of it is they don't want to spread curses, which is great, but they just have a tendency to drift a little bit further and further back. The thing to keep in mind is you can actually do this fight with all melee. You absolutely can. I've seen it done. But everyone has to know when those curses are coming out. And as soon as the curses go out and the 2 seconds passes, everyone can go into a melee position and bunch up on this guy, because he's not going to send a second set of curses out immediately. Again, that requires timing and a lot more expertise in this particular fight, but I have seen it done with all melee. The 4 range, 4 melee setup is best for most groups, and for our groups in particular. So just keep that in mind. If you have a range person and you see them drifting backwards, you need to call out, hey, scoot in, you're okay, you're drifting too far back. Because the further back they go, the more chances they're going to get targeted with a pillar, and it's going to be pretty far back for everyone, including the tanks.
They're going to be out of heals, too.
Correct.
Be out of heals.
All right. Tank responsibilities, real briefly on this. This is one of those situations where your tanks have to communicate with each other, and you have to trust them to do that. You can't communicate for them, because if you have someone cursed, one of the tanks cursed and they have to go cleanse, the other tank has to pick the boss up. Now, the way we work it here is if both tanks are cursed, the off tank will go cleanse first and come back and pick up the boss, so the main tank can then go cleanse. That's pretty much what you do if both of them are cursed.
Yeah, you don't want the boss moving. That's why the main tank does not go first.
The problem,
you let the other guy go cleanse first.
The problem here is overtaunting. This is why it's super important that tanks talk to each other, because the first pass that they do back and forth is not a big deal. Like, there have been times when I've immediately put a pierce on the boss, I get cursed, and Fel has to come in and pick up, and he picks the boss up immediately, and that's okay. Okay? However, if he does that, and then he's cursed the very next hit, I have to wait for his taunt to wear off. Because if there's any of my taunt left from the very first time, and I go to pierce him, he will become taunt immune, and then you have a problem on your hands. So your tanks have to communicate. They, and they have to know after that first pass, they have to ask first, is he ready to be picked up? Tell me when I can taunt him. Because you're not watching their taunt, bar they are. I see a lot of new tanks panic. They go cleanse, and they come back, and they think immediately they've got to grab the boss. They need to take a breath and take a step, and they need to talk to their co-tank and say, can I pick him up? Real important, and it's a skill that new tanks learn a lot of times by trial and error and by making the mistake of over taunting. So that was the last thing I wanted to call out there. Healers, this setup for the new orb change recently is fairly challenging, but healers also need to talk. You can have one healer that, you know, can send an orb directly through all the melee and they're Gucci. The range, it's a little bit trickier. If one of your healers is a Templar, I would advocate that they drop shards on the tank only. It's just easier that way. Sometimes the tank can grab the orb, but for positioning purposes, it's a lot easier to just drop a shard on a tank. And that's pretty much it.
It's also important for the healers to fan their combat prayer. I see a lot of healers that will just combat prayer right into the melee stack. And but if you look at the positioning, that means that the people in R1, R2, R3, and R4 are not getting combat prayer if the combat prayer is going straight at M1 and M4. So it's very important for the healers to also make sure you're fanning your combat prayer. Fan it once towards the melee, and then turn to your right or your left and fan it towards the ranged people that are immediately to the side of you.
There's a way to figure out if your healers are doing this too, and it's by looking in the logs and calculating the number of casts they've done over the time period the fight went on. But I'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah. It's also, actually, I would add too that it's also important when I've healed it and I see an orb floating through the middle of the melee stack towards the boss, I won't throw my orb that direction. I'll turn to my right and I'll kind of float it right in between the melee and the ranged people, so those folks can get an orb too. They won't be able to reach the one that floats through the middle. But if I float one to my right, I'm usually an H1. If I float one to my right, because I've seen one coming from the other side through the melee stack, that way, and it works on the other side too with H2. If they see same thing, just remember that your range folks are out there and they need resources too. Give them love.
So that brings up also an important point as far as the healers go. You need to make sure that, you know, position wise, you know, you are communicating with your healer on the other side as to what you're doing. It's not just tank communication. So a lot of times, and I've heard this, you know, if your raid leader is not a healer or a tank, it can get really chaotic with a lot of people calling stuff. So the damage dealers, really and truly, there's nothing that they need to be calling. They don't even need to call out when they're dead, because the healers are going to keep an eye on it. They're going to see that they're dead. We'll get reses out. But if we can keep comms clear for this particular fight, because you've got a lot of extra calls going out, that's ideal. One thing that healers in TBC need to really consider running is group synergy tracker. Because even though you put an orb through the middle with those melee guys, you may have had a melee guy on a pad waiting to cleanse. You may have had two melee people on a pad waiting to cleanse. And so you want to make sure that you keep your damage dealers, you keep their resource batteries charged throughout this fight. All right, so on to the trash. So we're introduced to two additional trash NPCs that become fairly important. These are big ogres. There's a shaman who's he's black with white stripes, and you have renderers. And renderers, their fur color is more golden white, and they have these big claws on I guess they're kind of like fist weapons. And so moving on to the next trash pool diagrams, essentially if you had to orient yourself to that top diagram, you're coming in down at the at this bottom part here, this southern part here, and you're looking out around a curve. The idea is to orient yourself to the brazier. There's going to be a shaman and then a bunch of smaller ogres, brutes is what they're called. And the idea for the one tank is to go in there and to taunt them, to keep them kind of grouped up, and you just AoE the trash down. while you have another tank that's actually going around the corner to spawn the next group that's going to run up a ramp. Now, a lot of people will skip this trash, and there's a way to do that by passing on the right side of that brazier. It's actually passing around a group of rocks and trees, and you certainly can. You can pass this corner group of trash, because it's not just the brutes and the shaman. There's going to be two archers, a one-handed shield, a two-hander, and a mage that spawn as well. However, skipping trash does two things. One, it lowers your score. Two, if you happen to disconnect or have people that disconnect, they're going to have to get through that trash to get back to you, depending on how far down you've gone. There have been people that have skipped all this trash, gone all the way down the ramp to where the first gauntlet is, and have gone into the cave, and some of the trash will come, some of it won't, but again, you're taking a big risk that nobody in your group is going to disconnect, and we all know that with ZOS fights and ZOS trials, that's a big risk. And it's just cleaner that way. You know, you just want to clean everything up, work on your efficiency. It doesn't take that long at all, and to kill all the trash.
Gare, can I add something about that first trash pull there?
Okay.
On the diagram where it says trash pulls 4 through 6. That diagram at the very top is actually the second wave on that first pull.
It is the second wave. I know.
I just wanted to.
Oh yeah.
Just for the recording, there is a group of shaman and brutes that are right before that trash pull. It made the diagram too cluttered by adding them in, and that's actually a really easy pull, so I didn't include it. That top diagram, that's actually wave 2 of that first trash pull.
I'm going to try... Okay, I'm going to try and go through this quickly, because we haven't even gotten to the twins yet, and I've been talking for about 40 minutes now. There's a lot to this trial, obviously. But just looking at the arrows in particular, it can be fairly complicated if you've not done this before, but essentially what you'll do is you'll always have one tank that pulls the two-hander away from the group, just because of that shatter mechanic. Now, there are groups that will actually have that tank kite that two-hander around all of the others. To me, just my own personal philosophy is I don't think it's any faster, and all you're doing is, if your DPS are not stacked up tight, you're running the risk of shattering some of your DPS and creating unnecessary deaths. But we will pull the two-hander off. The main tank will go in, taunt both archers and the one-handed shield, and they will run to where there's another set of braziers, not past them, but to them, and it will stack up the archers really nicely. The next set of trash that you run into on that same ramp, you will have a shaman and you will have a renderer. Now, normally we will have one tank pick up the shaman and one pick up the renderer, because the renderer will do a mechanic where he screams. That's bad. You don't want him to get a scream off, because it will knock everybody on their ass, and if the shaman is still alive and if he's pulsing, people will take a metric shit ton of damage. So normally we'll have one tank that will pick up that renderer, and when he starts to scream, he basically like throws his arms up like he's going to yell. You just bash him and it will interrupt him. And he'll do that pretty much every time he takes a breath until he dies. So you'll want to make sure that you keep him interrupted as much as possible. This trash pack goes down pretty quick as long as everything is together. The last trash pack before the gauntlet, again, you'll have an archer, you'll have a one-handed shield, you'll have a two-hander, and a mage. Again, mage is always priority. You'll have one tank that will pull the one-handed shield to the archer and stack them, and then you will have someone who pulls the two-hander off to the side. And that's pretty much it for that trash before the first gauntlet. So in this trial, we have, I consider 3 gauntlets. And a gauntlet is successive waves of ads, is basically what I call it. And you can say all these mini gauntlets, but really and truly, this trial has 2.5, but really 3 gauntlets. The first gauntlet is before the twins fight. And then you will have 2 gauntlets between the twins and Rakat. I'm not going to go through all of these diagrams, but what I will say is that the way we do it is you'll have one tank that's designated that whenever there's a two-hander in the wave, they will pick up the two-hander. Sometimes they will actually, I think this wave 4, they will pick up the two-hander that comes from the cave, and they will actually stack him on the archer. So they'll need to be mindful of that archer spray and make sure that they're not standing in it if they happen to get shattered. We will have renderers, we will have brutes, and we will have shaman successively throughout these waves. You can certainly review the waves that we have designated here. Jen and I both have Twitch streams showing how we pull those waves. And again, it's just been through years of experience and what works best for us. The main thing here is sometimes what I find a pitfall for a lot of new raid leads is they don't call horns during the waves. And I think part of that is because they don't consider it, quote, a boss fight. And so they don't generally think of using horns during the trash pulls or the waves. I'd say you got it, use it. Now there is a transition point between... where is it? Wave. I think it's between. Yep. Yeah, it's between wave 2 and 3. And if a tank happens to get shattered, and the renderer and the shaman come out from the door, that tank, if it's not a DK and they don't have a magma, they're going to need a healer to be paying really close attention to them, because picking up the renderer and the shaman when they're shattered a lot of times will lead to a tank death. Mm-hmm. So just be mindful of that. Normally, this is one wave in particular where horns are super important, because you're going to have a renderer come from the cave, you're going to have a renderer come from the door, and everyone is going to stack up here. Those renderers have to be kept interrupted, and so you've got, you know, 2 people bashing, which uses stamina plus a bunch of little adds. So you want to make sure that you keep the synergies going. You want to make sure that you keep horns going. Between wave 3 and 4, you have a renderer and a shaman still, but you now have a mage, a two-hander, and an archer. So again, you want to make sure you have horns rolling for wave 4. After wave 4, I don't do any horns at all. I actually tell people to build their ultimates so that when you go into the twins fight, you've got ultimates up for tanks and healers. Essentially, it's just, again, all of the same adds that we've had before, but in successive waves. So let's go on to the twins fight, because that's the one that seems to hurt most groups, stall most groups. The twins fight's an interesting mechanic. I remember when we first went into the twins room on PTS, and I was looking around. I came from World of Warcraft. That's my MMO background. And there's a fight in Wrath of the Lich King in a place called the Colosseum. And it had to do with colors. It had to do with these mobs that there were 2 of them, twins essentially, and they each were a different color. The mechanics were a little bit different, but the concept was there. And when I walked into this room and I saw these 2 different two-legged cats, and they were different colors, I thought, oh shit, we've got color introduction into ESO. And sure enough, that's what it is. The reason that this fight is so difficult for raiders, first off, is because it's counterintuitive. Essentially, you have to maintain the opposite color over your head compared to the boss you're fighting. And it's really hard for a lot of people to get their mind wrapped around that, but when they do, they own it. So this particular fight has been known to break up guilds, obviously break up raid teams. It did back then for sure. And it can be definitely called a pug killer. It is a fight where one person can wipe a group if they're not executing the mechanics. It's a fight where, unless you have a really high DPS group that works very well synergistically together, it's very hard to carry someone through this. So the twins fight, the total DP or the total health on those bosses is 56 million. So for a 4-minute twins fight, and again, this is not taking any mechanics involved, this is raw data. For a 4-minute fight, your DPS have to average 23k. For a 3-minute fight, it's 39k, and for a 2-minute fight, it's 58k. And that's per damage dealer. Alright. So going on to the twins. The way that this fight is set up is you have Skinra, which is the gold cat, and Vashai, which is the purple cat, on opposite sides of the room. There is a center line of candles that divide the room in half. You have an exit, which is denoted by this blue glowy mural on the wall, and then obviously your entrance. The reason the cat color is important is because they will put out an aspect on the people that are closest to them. And that aspect will be the same color that they are. Now, as I said, you have to be battling the boss that's opposite the color over your head, or opposite your aspect. How this is done is, again, this is a very tank-heavy fight as far as responsibility. Your tanks have to work out a way to shift the bosses so that the light boss is being beat on by the people with the purple aspect, and the purple boss is being beat on by the people with the gold aspect. There's two ways to do this. The first way is that tanks will cross taunt at a certain point in the fight, and they will literally cross taunt each neutral phase. And so the bosses are switching sides after every neutral phase. The other method is what we call tanks to original bosses. I have done a positioning workshop to show healers and tanks how this is done on a ground level, and that seemed to help people. Trying to discuss these mechanics is very hard because this is a very visual fight. This fight, you can sit all day long and talk about mechanics to your group, but until they actually see it, it's not going to make a damn bit of sense to them at all, especially if they're brand new to this. So, normally the way the fight starts, we have our melee folks stacked up on entrance side with a tank. We have our range folks stacked up with a tank on exit side. They are across from each other in the center of the room. Each side will have a healer. The dark boss will be taunted. Actually, I've got this diagram backwards, but the dark boss is going to be on, as you're coming in the entrance, he's going to be on the right side. Your light boss, as you come in the entrance, he's going to be on the left side. So your entrance tank is going to range taunt or chain the dark boss into the stack. The other tank on the opposite side will do the same with the light. So they're fairly close proximity to each other in the center. You'll use a horn, and people will drop their ultimates to get a lot of cleave damage on both bosses. When the bosses go to put their aspects out, they will crouch down, and they won't move while they're doing this. The tanks will then range taunt across the line to the opposite boss. So when those bosses come up out of their crouch, they themselves will cross over to the tank that just taunted them. That's how you move the bosses to the appropriate damage group. A couple of pitfalls with this particular fight. Movement is a huge pitfall. One of the mechanics is that the boss during the fight will put out an aspect color change on 3 random people. It could be a damage dealers, it could be healer. It will not be a tank unless the tank has dropped taunt off that boss or the tank's died. But regardless, once taunt drops off, the tank is susceptible to it. 3 people in that group will have their aspect color changed. This is a huge problem if they stay in the group. You cannot mix colors. You do, you die. So those 3 people have to pay attention to a circle under their feet. If they're fighting the light boss, they have a purple aspect. When he changes their color, there will be a circle under their feet for a brief period of time that's gold. The movement is what's important. Everyone who has a color aspect change moves in a clockwise direction. This prevents them from crossing the midpoint and blowing up the other side before their aspect color change is complete. That's why we have them go clockwise. So that you've got one group moving in, one group moving out, and the streams don't cross. That's a really tough concept for some new raid leaders and trialers because they panic. They look down, their color's changing, they know they've got to get out, and boom, what do? They run across the middle. It's a very classic newbie mistake because they panic. They don't want to blow up their team if they're paying attention. They don't think they have time to get to the other side going clockwise, so they run across the middle. And that always has a bad outcome. Another pitfall with regard to color change is people not taking reses immediately. So colors are put out initially based on proximity. That's if you have 6 on each side. Proximity gets messed up when you have an uneven number. There have been times when we've done a center stack where color change has gone, or, the initial aspect has gone out and one side gets completely blown up. And that's because it was uneven. You had an extra person on one side. And so colors got messed up and someone in the middle of the group, all of them were supposed to get light aspect, and guess what? One person in the middle got dark and blew up the entire group. So that's why it's important you make sure that both sides are even. If someone dies, either before transition or after or whatever, and they get a res, they need to take it immediately and back away from the group if they don't know what color they are. Now, usually the person resing them will be able to tell them what color they are because they are a pool of either gold or purple. The only time you want to delay taking a res is when they are about to do their room explosion. That's the only time. Any other time a res goes out, they need to take it immediately and move away from the group. A couple of things for raid leaders to note on this particular fight, and in no particular order, mind you, is your healers have to have purges on their bar. Either efficient purge or whatever the other one is. Because the light boss will do essentially a lunar flare that will put a dot on people, and that has to be purged off. Back when we first started doing this trial, that dot would kill you. It was rough. So healers, and actually tanks, I run purge on my tank all the time. And they need to be mindful of the mechanic of what it looks like when he's putting it out. Another pitfall, especially on the light boss, and if you've tanked the light boss, you will feel my pain, is his channel. The light boss and his adds, all the light adds, do a channel that you cannot break free from. You have to bash it or use crushing shock to interrupt it. If you don't bash it, that channel can kill a DPS, and sometimes it can even kill a tank, more often than not. The problem with the bash is when the bosses are split up and the first set, or the adds first drop, that boss will get a channel off on the tank, and if you don't bash that soon enough, the tank is not able to bring those adds in quick enough. Those gold adds have an affinity for the opposite tank, and if they get all up in that opposite tank's shorts, it makes it damn near impossible to get them chained in. Back in the day, we used to run DKs, DPS, and they were chained. That was their responsibility, was to chain adds in. DPS has increased so much that we don't run chainers anymore, even on the dark ad side, and tanks chain them. But it's imperative upon the DPS that they've got to make sure they bash those channels, or it could devolve into chaos very quickly. Another pitfall, and I see this on Light Boss all the time, is the DPS and the healer too. They will be all spread out way back here behind the Light Boss. They need to be up on that boss's ass. All of them. I don't care if you're range or melee. It doesn't matter. You need to be on that boss's ass. It's ideal also not to be in front of the boss. Everyone needs to be in a nice tight group on his butt. One of the problems that we've had in the past with raid notifiers, sometimes, depending on people's computers, their aspect over their head won't render. And so they don't really know what color they are, or they'll forget what color they are, or whatever. And color swap goes out, and they're not sure if they got a color swap, because that circle under your feet doesn't last forever. It's a couple of seconds and then it's gone. If you're unsure, you look up. If 3 people have done the rotation, you're good. If only 2 people have, you can back up a little bit and look over your head. But there's also on Raid Notifier a little box that will actually change color if you happen to have your aspect change. A lot of this stuff is hard on new trialers and new raid leaders because all of these mechanics happening at the same time. This fight is light speed and you don't pick up everything. It does slow down. And once it slows down, you're able to see all of these markers and all of these cues. So not bashing the channel is problematic. No purges, problematic. Movement, running across the middle, or not rotating when they go into prayer phase. The bosses will jump up into the ceiling and they'll either come back to them to the side they were on, or they'll go to the opposite side. The idea is if the same color boss drops on your side that's the aspect over your head, you need to rotate. And again, you got to rotate clockwise. When to call horns. So obviously you're going to call a horn at the beginning to get as much cleave and damage on the bosses as you can. After that, normally as a tank, I will call my horns as soon as they come up. You can also have a healer do a horn in the middle during neutral phase. Vashai, a lot of times, will have a little bit higher health than Skinra because of his mechanic, which is a negate. The tank will have to pull him out of his negate, and most people are at range. They just don't get as much damage on him. So a lot of times, you will hear, at least in our groups, someone calling out to focus Vashai at neutral. And that's just a range focus doing damage on him. As raid lead, it's your responsibility to pay attention to the boss's health and make sure that they're going down at about the same amount and same time, and to call your horns accordingly. Now, what happens if you have a boss that dies and the other boss still has a significant amount of health? Well, you're in trouble. The good thing is, when one boss dies, everybody's aspect falls away. So all your DPS on one side can cross over and DPS that one boss that's left. The problem is, if your DPS as a group is low, you only have a finite amount of time before he then goes to the middle and starts his solo prayer phase. When he finishes his solo prayer phase, he blows the room up. So that's why it's imperative that both of these bosses die around the same time, because you don't want him going to the center to do his solo prayer phase, because then it'll be a wipe. This fight is all about movement. It's all about moving together. It's all about moving appropriately and at the right time. If for whatever reason, as a raid lead, you have someone dead, during neutral, your tanks need to hug their bosses. Again, it's proximity, and you want the tanks to have the appropriate aspect. Whether they're boss swapping or whether they're going back to original bosses, it doesn't matter. They need to pick up the appropriate aspect, and they need to get close to that boss that's going to give them the right aspect. Everybody else, there may be someone in the group that gets the wrong aspect. It's on them to pay attention and to move away from everybody else. As far as healing assignments, if you have a healer that gets a color swap and a healer that does not, that will end up with 2 healers on the same side. There is a way to realign at the neutral phase. I'm not going to discuss it here, but there is definitely a way to realign your healers, and you definitely want to try and do that because, again, for purges, for combat prayer, for resource management, it's easiest when you have a healer on both sides. As far as resources go, this is a very resource-intense fight. You want your healers putting resources out when the DPS are on the cats killing them. You want them putting resources out during neutral phase. Resources need to be going out constantly. And since they made the orb change, in some ways it's gotten easier, in some ways it's gotten a little bit more challenging. But if you realign your healers, it will make it a lot easier on them to make sure their groups are topped off. A lot of times in lower DPS groups, you will get successively more adds that drop each round, and that gets really chaotic. And so a lot of times, because the DPS are taking unnecessary damage, your healers are more busy healing than they are putting resources out. The problem is, as you get close to execute, having your DPS topped off is super, super important. And so this is a very healer-intense fight. Just be mindful that if your DPS are calling for resources, they're already resource-starved, and they're already behind the 8 ball. So you'll need to be more cognizant of that and make sure that from that point on, you're putting resources out in a more consistent manner. There's a huge description in our channel about the summary of the movement for the bosses, for the twins, how to realign, how to reposition, how tanks can move back to original bosses. But again, a lot of this is visual and it's physical. And so I'm probably going to hold another repositioning workshop. It seemed to go pretty well to go over these position movements. I'm not going to go through these diagrams because, again, you can look at them in the channel. There's a healer realignment diagram that's very nice. All right, so the next set of gauntlets. We have 2 more before Rakat. The first gauntlet is preceded by the big cat pull. As you go into the next room, you're going to have 2 very large purple cats. And these are not nice kitties. These are not kitties you want to pet because they will swipe you and kill you. There are various ways to handle these cats. There are some people who can actually literally roll dodge enough times to get away from them, but keep them stationary that they can be DPS'd and killed very quickly. If your DPS is not real high, I wouldn't advocate that. The more common method is you'll have everyone crouch in a corner. You'll have a tank and a very fast-moving DPS, i.e. Sork with Streak, that will go up and get their attention. They will then put a black column over your head and essentially have marked you. It's a target mark, and they will chase you. We usually have people run clockwise around the room, but at a certain point, they will switch targets, and then it gets a little chaotic. Now, it doesn't always guarantee that you're going to have a tank and the standing DPS get the marked target. We have had people in the group get it, depending on how late it goes out. The idea is, though, you want to move. You want to keep moving. You can't block through it. You just can't. It's a one shot. You can roll dodge if your timing's good, but by and large, you just want to run away. Usually I will call out when targets are going to be changing and everyone can kind of be on their guard. When you look at the cat and he turns red and he looks at you, chances are you are his target. And then you need to keep moving. I would not advocate running up the ramps. There's a post up there that can sometimes block you. It's just, run the outer edges, simply put, and have the DPS focus one cat at a time. They go down faster that way. There are going to be a lot of little adds that one of the tanks going to have to corral because those lads, when they swipe you, they slow you. They kind of put a baby stun on you. So we want to get those down as well. Once the cats are dead, then we'll have gauntlet waves on either side of the room. There's a chain up top that gets pulled that triggers the event, and you'll have 3 successive waves of adds. This is also a very tank intensive fight because the tanks have specific targets that they are responsible for, and there's a specific way to stack. The main thing to keep in mind is that on the left side, you're going to have a two-hander, you're going to have archers, you're going to have a mage, you'll have the next wave will be 2 one-handed shields, a two-hander. I mean, you get the picture. It's the same as we've seen before, it's just in successive waves. And the idea is, again, you're going to focus your mages down, your archers, your one-handed shields, and finally your two-handers. Different groups do this differently, and, you know, I don't dictate to the teams how they, you know, pull the ads and what direction they pull them. But if you ever watch Jen run a trial or myself, we pull them in the exact same way every time, just because it's a habit and it's worked for us. Once you're done with the right side or the left side, then you go to right side, vice versa, and you'll clear those successive trash packs, and you do get a treasure chest afterwards. The last gauntlet is the Room of Pain, or Room of Death, or Slaughterhouse, depending on how you want to phrase it. It's a very long, narrow corridor, and you have 3 successive waves of ads, again, the same ads we've seen before: mages, two-handers, one-handed shields, and archers. The added mechanic in this room, though, are the bombers. These are little cats that jump down from the ceiling, and when they hit the ground and they come close to someone, they will explode. Little kamikaze cats. Things you can put down on the ground that will help kill them before they reach you include caltrops. They'll even still work even though they've been nerfed, and Ritual of Retribution. Those 2 things are just enough damage that those cats generally will die before they get close enough. However, if they do get close to you, there will be an AoE circle that expands fairly quick. You need to just get away from them. In TBC, we always will handle the right side mage first. And I guess as you're going in, that's the east side. The first wave, you have 1 mage. The second and third wave, you have 2 mages in each of those waves. Cold. But we'll always do the right side mage first and then go left and then move on from there. The thing about raid leading this room specifically in a TBC raid is for waves 2 and 3, both tanks will be at the exit, and they will need at least one of the healers dedicated to come down and keep an eye on them, because wave 2, you've got two-handers. Wave 3, you've got a two-hander, a one-handed shield, 2 mages, and 2 archers, and their positioning is kind of funky. But it's easier for the tanks if they're both in the same area, and actually easier for the healers as well, as they're not spread out. So just be mindful that when you go to this room, you know, you need to call out, okay, who's going to be responsible for the tanks at the exit. A lot of times during this, people will forget horns. And I would say, at least for wave 2, you need a horn at the very minimum. Simply because if wave 2, if you fuck up wave 2, it makes it really hard because those cats will eat your lunch. Wave 3 as well, but hopefully by that time, both mages are dead fairly quickly and you'll be able to move on. The one thing to note about this room, if you wipe in this room, when you come back up, the ads will, they're either there or they will spawn right away. Now, in the past, there have been groups that have actually put one person outside the room so that they wouldn't have to start the whole event all over again. We don't do that. If you wipe in this room and you have to start over, you start over. We don't cheese it like that. So just be mindful that if you do wipe, you generally have to start over. A lot of groups will do that because this room is intense. It's very narrow and it's somewhat claustrophobic. But just make sure that all the DD know what your target priorities are and in what order. This is the final wave of trash, ads, whatever, before the final boss. There is a ante-room before the final boss fight, and a lot of times as raid lead, I'll make sure everybody's there, everybody's gear is repaired, their food is good, and I make sure that we finally go over the last strats for the final fight. So the Rakat fight is an interesting fight. You have a boss, you have a Hulk ad, you have a backroom mechanic. So the backroom mechanic is something that you need to designate before you even start the raid. Who are going to be your backroom runners? They have a specific job back there that if they are unable to complete it, it will actually cause a wipe out in the front room. When you walk into the room, you'll see 8 small pads around a very large pad. Depending on your DPS, a couple of things you need to keep in mind. I don't necessarily think it's a problem now, but back in the day, there was a phase of this fight called Lunar Phase that we generally had to go through routinely. Because DPS has increased so much, and even now with the nerf, I don't necessarily think it would be a problem. You really don't have to go through Lunar Phase like you did back then. But you do have to be mindful of these pads for execute. So when you come in as a raid lead, you'll have your 2 backroom runners designated already. And then what you'll want to do is you'll want to assign people a pad of responsibility for execute. When he goes to the center for execute, these small blue tethers will hook to him from these pads. And as long as they stay hooked to him, his damage taken is reduced significantly. So what you'll want to do is make someone responsible for either sprinting or rolling across the pad to break that tether. The caveat to that is, if they are already debuffed with the Breath of Lorcage, and their body is kind of glowing purple, if they roll across this pad to break the tether, it will kill them. These cleanse pads that are located in here are for your backroom runners. When they come out from the back room, they're going to have the Breath of Lorcage on them, and they use these cleanse pads to take that off. Once the cleanse pad is used, it's effectively dead. They can't be used again. As a raid lead, there's a lot to pay attention to in this room. You have to pay attention to when these pads change colors, when the Hulk comes out, the mechanics for each section change, your backroom runners. All of these items are things as a raid lead you need to pay attention to. Mechanics such as meteors, knockbacks, the Hulk, and killing him in time, barrage on the main tank. These are all mechanics of this fight that you need to have a thumb on during the entire fight. And on top of that, be able to call horns. For me, calling horns as the main tank was easy. It was when I became the off tank and I started working with the Hulk that it got a little bit more difficult, but I can do it fine now. Calling horns from a healer or a tank position is much, much easier on this fight, I think, but that's just my own personal opinion.
Or you just make, you do it.
Right. Your backroom runners have to go back at certain points in time because their responsibility includes killing certain cats to essentially shut down the back room. If the back room goes live, then everyone out here gets sucked down into the floor and it's a wipe. They have a finite amount of time to do that. We have diagrams in the channel on pathways that they can take. There's a right and a left side, but there's a right and left set of braziers that they need to uncover and 2 in the back. So essentially what you have to do is find 2 cats on the left, 2 cats on the right, and 2 in the back and kill them. Once you kill all 6 cats, all the brazier lights go out and you know you're done. Now sometimes that's happened and we've still wiped. This mechanic is kind of sometimes. Back in the day, this is also kind of a little tidbit, at about pad 3, if people had their sound on, they would get disconnected. Now, they say they fixed it, but I have still been disconnected on pad 3 specifically when my sound was on. I've learned to run without my sound on. It was hard because I'm auditorily driven when I run these trials, but I've gotten to the point where I can watch their mechanics. There is a relationship between the Hulk and Rakat that's very important that you need to share with your tanks. The Hulk will do a squat that when he comes up out of the squat, it will stun everyone in the room. That's not great. But when the Hulk is out, Rakat will also do a bashable, interruptible mechanic that actually empowers the Hulk. So your main tank is also responsible for a bash and responsible for it on Rakat. Your off tank is responsible for the bash on the Hulk. However, everyone who's around the Hulk is also responsible for bashing that mechanic because everyone can see it. You need to remind your people, starting with pad 2 to pad 4, they need to take unstable voids to the wall. From pads 4 to pad 6, there are tethers. I don't know if they're fixed. I will assume they are still broken, which means that when a tether attaches to someone, they must walk it out of the group. Not sprint, not dodge roll. Walk it out of the group. Occasionally it will still break, and it will attach to someone else. The main thing is you don't want the ball at the end of the tether to hit you, because it can kill you. The last mechanic are beach balls, and they start roughly transition pad 6 to 7. And these are stationary balls that form, and they're static, but if you step into them, they will explode. You can see one forming when there's an AoE circle underneath your feet, and if you just sidestep it, you're good. All 3 of those mechanics will happen during execute when the boss is in the middle. So DD need to be mindful of that. During execute as well, a Hulk will spawn on this back pad 5, and you generally just have a tank pick it up and hold it. They don't have to do anything. The Hulk has a mechanic where he does a slam on the off tank. The off tank can take 2 slams. If he gets a third one, there's a very strong chance he will die, because that third slam shatters him, and it's effectively taking all of his armor away. So if he gets 2 slams, then that Hulk needs to be passed back to the main tank, and the main tank will hold it until they get a slam, and then the off tank can pick him back up. We have several videos that show this particular fight ad nauseum, so please avail yourself to the information in the channel. As far as calling horns on this fight, we will generally have horn to start. We will call a horn when he hops to pad 1. We'll call another horn transitioning to pad 2. And then you just rotate horns as you're going around the room. Most groups can get him pushed to execute by pad 7 or 8. Some groups can push at pad 5, and there are some groups who can push at pad 3. The aggregate DPS that's needed for this fight, again, keeping in mind this isn't taking all the movement into effect, is a 4-minute fight requires 33.6k DPS, a 3-minute fight requires 45k DPS, and a 2-minute fight requires 67.2k DPS. When you are moving the Hulk will spawn pad 2, 4, 6, and 8. And you generally want that Hulk dead by the time you're done with pad 3, 5, and 7. Pad 3, 5, and 7 are long pads. You're on there for 60 seconds. So when you pick up the Hulk transitioning from 2 to 3, or excuse me, you'll pick up the Hulk transitioning 1 to 2, but you're going to drag the Hulk to pad 3, and hopefully by that time you won't have to pass him back again. The tank is able to stack the Hulk, so he's backed up against Rakat and he dies to cleave. Pads 2, 4, 6, and 8 are 30-second pads. Pad 1, you've got a 10-second fight in the center and 15 seconds on pad 1 before you transition to pad 2. Tank movement from pad to pad is determined by the successive pad turning gold. The main tank, when he's got Rakat, will watch that pad, and as soon as it starts to hint at changing gold, he moves. Rakat will stay on the pad back here. Your DPS need to stay on Rakat and continue to DPS him. That pad, however, will turn purple. If a DPS gets a toe on it, they will get the Breath of Lorcage. A pitfall for raid leads on this fight is missing a call. In other words, missing a call for meteors, missing a call for the knockback, forgetting their horns. Those are all very common mistakes. And a lot of it will get better the more practice you have. These cleanse pads are sacrosanct, meaning the DPS have to position themselves behind Rakat and the Hulk so that if they happen to not be blocking a thrashing wing, they won't get knocked into the pad and take it by accident. If your backroom runners come out and there's not a cleanse pad for them to take, then you usually will have them die close to the center pad to be rezzed. Anyone who dies in this fight will have cats that spawn from their body until they're rezzed. The problem is those cats put a nice bleed. They can't be taunted, just like the cats on Jahasa. And they just are a pain in the ass. They have little health, so you can actually cleave them down. But the idea is to get the res out very quickly. The problem is if you have someone dying coming from back room back here, and depending on where Rakat is, his barrage mechanic, if you're not careful, can kill you. The tanks need to call out when they're getting barraged. It's just good practice. And that way the stack healer can focus them and make sure that they're getting enough heals. Back in the day, we used to run guard between the two tanks. It's not necessary now unless you're doing hard mode. And even then, it's questionable. But for being conservative, we would probably still run guard on hard mode. But yeah, so tanks need to call out barrage so that the healer can kind of focus them, keep an eye on them. This requires a lot of trust. Bottom line. There's a lot of trust here because you have to trust your damage dealers to execute mechanics. You have to trust your backroom runners, who you have no control over, to do their job. You have to trust that your two tanks know what they're doing. That's why it's important that you run with at least one experienced tank. As far as what I do at the end of a run, when I'm looking over the data, we use ESO logs. It's pretty much, generally what you do when you look over logs. I'll watch streams to see what people's positioning is. If there's someone who had a really high death count, I'll go back and look and see what was killing them. Were they constantly dying to X? Was that because they were out of position or out of heals or what have you? But I will always do a recap, and I will always give feedback to the team. And I generally will give feedback individually and as a group. If I see someone is having significant struggles on something, I'll try and pinpoint it, and I'll send them specific instructions. I'll send them, specific feedback. Whether it's positioning, whether it's, standing in the wrong place, not getting unstable voids out of the group, standing in arrow spray, whatever it is. I also will give specific feedback to my healers and tanks about buff and debuff uptime. Those are really important, and they can really, really affect your group's DPS if they're not appropriate. The main thing at the end of the day, as far as this trial goes, is it requires a lot of trust, even in an open. You have to trust your team to execute the mechanics, and they have to trust you to know the mechanics and help them through, to anticipate what's coming next, to be able to call horns on a regular basis, to, guide and direct people at that point in time when they're out of position, and do it in a way that's not negative or, I hate using the word toxic because I really hate that word, but you want it to be constructive feedback, and it's a skill as a raid lead that you just have to develop. And you have to understand, when you're at certain points of the fight, am I going to tell people to res, or am I going to tell people to DPS? Am I going to tell people to back off, or am I going to tell people to unload? Am I going to tell people to shift left? Am I going to tell people to shift right? All of those little nuances as a raid lead are things that you're going to have to figure out as you go through these trials. And you can watch Jen and I do it. You can watch Cole do it, all day long. You can be in a trial with us calling, but until you're actually doing it and figuring out your own rhythm, then it's really hard for me to give you any information beyond what I've talked about. But it all does hinge on trust. And if you go into a trial and, you know, you've got one person who says, oh, yeah, I looked everything up, I read everything, I'm good, and they're making the same mistakes over and over again, chances are they didn't. You know, it's kind of a weird culture back when I first started raiding, because in Warcraft, we had to watch videos, we had to read up on strats, we had to do all of our homework. And I find that a lot of ESO raiders are kind of like, yeah, let's just run in and see how it goes. And that's okay, you know, on Craglorns, but a lot of these DLC trials, you're not going to get past the first boss if you do it that way. You know, this is one of the trials that I feel comfortable calling pretty much from any position, DPS, healer, or tank. And I've done every position pretty much. I don't think I've kite healed though, but I mean, I've pretty much run every other position. It's a great trial. I think it was probably one of their best design trials, and it's a fun trial. I think they have a great mix of trash and boss fights. I think the boss fights are elegant. But, you know, again, that's probably because I've spent so much time in there. I know I've run over a bit, but I'm going to stop because I'm thirsty. And I'm going to open the floor up to questions and see if you guys have any specific questions about fights, or specific questions about your groups, or what calls to make, or any general questions.
I'm just going to say thank you, Dragons. I really appreciate the time. And like I said, this is a trial that I'm very familiar with and love it, but it's always good to hear perspective from other people who are leading.
Well, certainly.
Yeah, getting the reasoning back in a lot of those fights was interesting to hear, because I had been taught slightly differently how to do like the Zajasa fight. So hearing why you do the things you do.
And I think that's important because, you know, I've had people tell me, like, there was a tank who told me, you know, I was never told why we swap on the committee and halls of fabrication. I was just told to swap. And I thought to myself, wow, that's, to me, that's like sending, you know, a blind man in to do a free throw. There's a chance he'll get it, but he can't see it. So, you know, to me, not having the information leaves a lot to chance. These fights, the more you know about them, the more empowered you are to be able to make decisions on the fly. You know, we went back, it was really kind of interesting. There was one run that we did in particular, and we had someone in Melee Stack who was calling out that curses were getting spread, curses were getting spread, curses were getting spread, over and over and over. And the rest of the DPS were pretty stressed about it. And we went back and, okay, thanks, Dark. We went back and looked at the video. Nobody was spreading curses. Unfortunately, this person was targeted by Rakat for curses over and over and over again. A lot of times what you think you see in a trial, when you go back and review the stream, it's not what it was. So when I call out stuff in a trial, I try and make damn sure I know what I'm talking about. And it's usually only in the trials that I feel really comfortable about. Even then, though, there are times when I thought I saw something, but I go back and I look at the stream and it's like, nope, that's not what it was. And that's okay. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. You're going to make a call. I mean, that's your job as the raid leaders, to make the call. It's just be okay with the fact that occasionally you're going to make mistakes. Matter of fact, you make a lot of mistakes. But to understand the reasoning behind it it empowers you to make the right choices more frequently, if that makes sense. Anybody else have any questions?
I think you were fairly exhaustive.
Oh, Cold, I love you.
You know what?
That was the best description of one of Dragon's talks I've ever heard.
This is
No.
this is a complicated trial. I mean,
Hun, you did a great job.
breaking it down is really hard because you can break it down for DPS, you can break it down for tanks, you can break it down for healers. The problem is, and the challenge is, as a raid leader, you've got to know all of that. And that's a lot to digest. And that's why, a lot of times when you look at the diagrams, you're like, what the hell? And it's not until you actually see it that, oh yeah, that makes sense now. I mean, even just looking at the diagrams for lunar phase, it's kind of like, what is going on? But, when you're in there and you're actually doing it, it makes more sense. That's why I did the positioning workshop. Because even though we weren't in the trial, getting in the position and understanding the mechanic of realignment of the healers and, tanks back to original bosses made it much easier for people to be able to execute that live.
Well, and I will say too, when you start raid leading this trial, it's going to feel very chaotic, and you're gonna feel like you don't know what you're doing. But if you stick with it, look at the resources that are available, look at the streams, go back over stuff, it will get better. And I mean, Dragon and I have run it a lot. Out of all the trials in this game, this is the one where we know it backwards and forwards. And so we forget sometimes what it was like when we first started calling it. And you're going to get confused, and you're going to get, you're going to make a wrong call and stuff. And that's okay. Just remember, the more you're in there, the more you're going to take something away every single time you're in there. And you'll be like, okay, I know now, I understand. I've seen it multiple times. I get it now. And it'll just click, and it'll get easier, and you'll slowly
I think
know what you're supposed to be doing in certain places, and
right.
when you want to call horns, and
I
what
think
what to do if something goes south, etc.
part of what I tried to do tonight also is point out pitfalls, point out the areas where I see raid leads making mistakes. Not saying that you won't make those mistakes, but at least you'll understand, and you'll be like, oh yeah, that's right, or yep, that they said that, they mentioned that. And it just is an additional way to help you remember certain mechanics. You're responsible for a lot of stuff. There are a lot of moving parts in this trial. Frankly, from this trial forward, there are a lot of moving parts in all the DLC trials. So it's extremely challenging for raid leaders to have those down pat. And a lot of times in these more mechanically challenging fights, you're going to need DPS or healer help. We have someone in our group who is very good at calling certain mechanics at certain times, and people have grown to expect to hear his voice. And so it just makes it easier on the group if they're able to do that seamlessly, if they're able to do that without talking over raid leaders or talking over calls. And he's very good at being able to insinuate himself into making a call that everybody can hear, and it doesn't talk over people. With these trials, the more complex they are and the more chaotic that they have the potential to be, going into them armed with knowledge and having strong support players goes a long way to helping you clear. The main thing for DPS is to do this enough so that the trial slows down, so that they're able to pick up on all the nuances of things that they need to be aware of. The biggest thing for Jahasa is staying still. The biggest thing for the twins, stay still when you have to stay still, move correctly when you need to move. That sounds very simplistic. Executing it's a different story. On Rakat, stay in the group when you need to stay in the group. Again, move out when you need to move out. And I don't mean to make it sound simple, but when you look at it, that's essentially what you're doing. Making sure that what you're doing as a member of the team isn't going to cause the death of your teammates. And I find that that's the interesting part in this trial. For example, on the color swap mechanic, yeah, I mean, you not moving, you're going to cause your teammates death, not just yours. For unstable voids on Rakat, if you don't get out, chances are you're not going to die, but you're going to kill everyone around you. So there's an inherent level of trust among teammates to be able to execute this trial. And I think what you would call that is synergy. You know, teammates acting synergistically. Healers knowing where their tanks are going to hold the boss, where their tanks are going to move the boss to for their final position.
That's important in trash.
Yep.
Very much. So
very
that's why
much.
we've very kind of standardized a lot of the trash. I know a lot of us have been in there and have seen the first big gauntlet, talking about the first big one with the 5. And I've been in groups where it has just been a free-for-all because I was with a strange tank, didn't know where they were pulling stuff, and I would actually have to stop, look around, pinpoint where those guys were, and go to them. And so that's why the diagrams came into being, and where Dragon and I started pulling the trash in generally the same areas each and every time. And we actually started doing that back in the day when we first started running this, because it was just utter chaos if you didn't. And then this way, the not only do the tanks and the healers know where each other's going to be, but the DPS know where they're going to be as well. And that's kind of where, again, those diagrams that I made, they show the group movement. So you can all move as a group, because it's very, very easy to get spread out and have people start dying because they're not near anybody, they get themselves in trouble or whatnot, and then it just becomes a snowball from there. And remember, on any of those gauntlets, that first gauntlet too, you wipe on that first gauntlet,
you start over.
You do it all over again from round 1. So it became very important to kind of standardize that. Okay, the grouping of the archers is going to be here, and then the two-hander's going to be pulled over here, so everybody knows where they're going to be. And it makes it so much easier. I can't stress that enough, how much easier it is when you know where that stuff is going to be. And you can anticipate, even as a DPS, you can anticipate, oh, this is round 3, I know exactly where I need to go, and you can pre-position yourself, and you're there when the mage drops on the ground to start the wave.
And it's not just this trial, but all the DLC trials, it's that way.
Yeah.
You know, it's all right, so let's you know, throw it out there. It's understanding how your tank is going to hold the factotum, the second boss on Hoth. It's understanding how your tank is going to help you down in the portal on CR. You know, it's understanding where the group is supposed to stack on Zamaja for execute. All of it has to do with synergy. That's why the DLC trials are so much harder as a pug, because it's not just the calls, and it's not just you as an individual knowing the mechanics, it's the 11 other people in the group knowing the mechanics like you do. Make it much easier. So, you know, people going into a pug, now, do pugs clear these trials? Of course they do. Hell, pugs clear these on hard mode. But those are players that have been in here so much, as not as a collective, but individually, that they're able to adjust and adapt. These are players that, you know, they run the hard mode Mauve Lurkage and do a pad 3 burn. You know, these are the players that get the 200k VHOF scores, because they understand not just the importance of DPS, but the importance of positioning and executing mechanics.
So from a DLC trial perspective, there's several. So say you've got a newer team that's moving through the Craiglorns. When you get comfortably past them and have worked on the team synergies and things, which DLC do you tend to want to start with?
I think
or does it depend on the team?
Well, you know, always you want to have the caveat that it depends on the team, but of all the DLC trials that are out there, the one that is the most forgiving of a new group is Asylum Sanctorum. And the reason is because the Olms fight specifically, it's slow and steady. And you can recover from massive deaths, even if you have a tank death. If you're not doing any of the pluses and you're just doing a regular vet Asylum Sanctorum, that is probably the most forgiving of all the DLC trials. Not saying you're not going to have a lot of deaths, but, you know, we've gone on in there, and I think one run we had almost 200 deaths total, and we were able to clear it. So it's definitely the one that I would certainly start with. I think the hardest DLC trials, I think Halls of Fabrication is only hard because it's very lengthy, and there's a bit more RNG to it than, say, Maw of Lurkage. Cloud Rest, I think, is difficult for a newer group, and it's not, I mean, even the Cloud Rest plus 0, you have specific mechanics on the mini-boss fights that can wipe the group. You have specific mechanics on Zamaja that can easily wipe the group. And, you know, if your DPS aren't prioritizing correctly, it doesn't matter how good their DPS is. If all they're doing is fighting Zamaja and they're not taking out the creepers or the orbs, it's a wipe. So I think, for me, order of ease as far as, you know, going through trials, I would say AS is the easiest. Probably Sunspire after that. Maw of Lurkage being third. Probably Cloud Rest, and then Halls of Fabrication. In that order. But that's just my opinion.
Also, I would say that the easiest one for your group to progress to next would be the one you're most familiar with. And
correct.
Best at.
And that's a very good point. That's a very good point. Because as I said in the very beginning, you know, when I was starting all this, your comfort level is going to decide how easy or difficult the trial is as well. For all the DLC trials, I would say you need to have at least one experienced healer and one experienced tank, just because the DLC trials themselves inherently are very unforgiving of tank and healer mistakes, more so than I think Craglorns are.
And stuff like MOL, even the DPS have important roles too. If they're not on top of their game, it can be pretty bad.
Yeah, no, it definitely can. You know, I would say there's not a single, and you know, I mean, people disagree with me. I don't think any of the DLC trials, if your cumulative group DPS is sub 400k, I don't think you can muscle through any of the mechanics at all. I think that, especially with fights like the twins, even Rakat, you know, you're going to have a pad 3 burn, so you're not going to send runners in the back. Well, you damn well better be running 600k DPS total, because you would have to have that in order not to have a back room. Are there groups that do it? Yep, absolutely. But if you look at the bell curve, the distribution of raiders in this game, majority of raiders fall under the middle of the bell curve as what I call mid-tier raiders. And these are people who can complete the vet trials. You have varying degrees of proficiency. And you have trialers that can clear vet trials, but they have to work really hard at it. And you have vet trialers that are mid-tier who can clear the vet trials relatively easy. They struggle on the hard modes, and they may get half of the hard modes done. Some of the easier hard modes, if there are any. But, you know, again, the way this game is designed, the degree of difficulty between Craglorns and DLCs is a pretty wide gap. The difficulty between DLC vet and DLC hard modes is a pretty big gap. So, you know, that's unfortunate because there's not really a middle ground. But the more...
With that, then, would you have a newer team do Craiglorn hard modes before moving to DLC? Then?
Absolutely, I would. Again, as with the caveat that has to be something you're comfortable with as a raid leader calling. You know, it's the Craiglorn hard modes. Sanctum's the easiest, followed by Aetherian Archive, and I think Hell Ra is the most difficult because it requires a lot of coordination, pretty much. But I think, you know, you still have to have a command of the mechanics on the hard modes to be able to complete those as well.
Oh, it makes sense.
Any other questions? Jen, do you have any other comments?
No, I think you covered that really, really well. I hope you guys were able to glean some tips and tricks for putting your group together.
I have 4 pages of notes.
Well, I will say this. I mean, I'm gonna upload the video to YouTube, and then I'm gonna create a link so that people can watch it and listen. I mean, obviously, it's not a one and done. You know, Jen and I are at your disposal to answer questions, to watch parts of streams if you're not sure what's going on, to even run with you if you're stuck at a certain point. You know, she and I go through the logs a lot on all the team runs, not just our own. And sometimes having a fresh set of eyes on something helps. You know, we don't necessarily have to be in the actual run to go back and look at the log and go, this is a problematic theme right here. I wonder what's going on, and be able to give feedback to help you out. So, you know, we're available to answer any questions or help in any way we can.
Well, I'd also like to add too that you know, you don't just look at your logs. You know, I mean, that's important, but you know, compare them to one of the other logs that are up there of you know, there's multiple vMOLs, there's multiple SSs, and get an idea of, you know, you can glean some information there as far as, okay, this group did this fight in 2 minutes and my group did it in 4 minutes. What's the difference? Is it buff times? Is that something I need to talk to my team about? Is improving the buff times? Is it horns? Do horns need to be done more efficiently, et cetera, et cetera? I've gotten a lot of information by comparing runs between caffeines and caution when we were doing AS, and seeing kind of where the difference is, and seeing if there's anything that I can do for my team that maybe that worked for caffeines that maybe will work for us as well. Maybe it's positioning, maybe it's, you know, switching a role or switching gear or something. You can glean a lot by comparing logs as well. You know, in this run, this healer had 52 casts of combat prayer, and in this run it was only 15. Okay, what's the difference? You know, why is that something that, you know, needs to be looked at? What are they doing differently that I'm not doing, or, you know, vice versa, kind of thing. So I think you can glean a lot by comparing the runs as well, to get an idea of if there's anything else that you can do to improve your group success.
And don't forget to take advantage of other resources that are out there. I mean, Outcast actually has some really nice write-ups for the trials. Back when Jen and I first started running trials, there were no write-ups on any of the trials at all. And I mean, it took us, you know, combing through YouTube videos to try and find videos that, you know, didn't have a bunch of, you know, Japanese death metal in the background with no commentary. It took a lot of digging through,
I like it.
digging through, different kinds of streams in order to find something that we could follow. And just trial and error, and I mean, it was a struggle. Now you've got people like late night dungeoneers and Alcast and Zynode and a lot of people who are actually putting written guides out there. So take advantage of that as well, because they all have different perspectives. The thing to understand, though, is understand who the creator is and what his background or her background is. Alcast he has videos like for Sanctum. He has videos posted of Manticore fights, straight burn Manticore fights. Well, if your DPS isn't as high as the group he runs with, that may not be something that you can do. So again, understand who, they always say for authors and presenters and artists, know your audience. Well, the audience also needs to know the artist. And so, take it with a grain of salt when you're given information. Is this something that can apply to your group? As a raid leader, that's one of the most important skills to develop, is to take a strat and look at it, understand your composition, your group, their limitations, their strengths, and ask yourself, honestly, is this a strat that's going to work with my group? Now, sometimes you're not going to know unless you just trial and error it and throw it out there like spaghetti and see if it sticks to the wall. Sometimes it sticks, sometimes it doesn't. The thing to understand, though, is if it doesn't, figure out why. It may just mean you have to tweak it here or there. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater just yet. See if it's a strat that can be modified. Again, a very important skill as a raid leader. You don't want to parrot. You don't want to mimic things and try and force a round peg into a square hole. You really have to critically think and look at your composition, look at the mechanics, understand your comfort level, look at the strat, and connect all those dots. If that strat works for one team, it doesn't automatically mean it's going to work for another team. There are certain rules of thumb that pretty much all teams have to follow. But by and large, how you execute a certain boss fight can be dependent upon the composition and strength and experience of your group. I guess what I'm trying to say is, just because it works for Team A, it doesn't mean that it will work for Team B in its current iteration. It could work for Team B with a couple of tweaks on the front side and the back side. So make sure that you think it all the way through and don't knee-jerk and say, oh, it's not going to work. See if there's a way you can modify it enough so that you can execute the mechanics and kill the boss and get fat loots. If for whatever reason you're looking at it going, okay, my group is nowhere ever going to have this kind of DPS, this is kind of a silly strat to even look at, that's fine too. If you want to do it for just shits and giggles, that's fine too. But make sure, again, like I said in the very beginning, you express your expectations and your goals to the group that you're running with up front. You don't want to surprise on them, oh, by the way, this is a skin carry for Joe Schmo over here. Sorry I didn't tell you sooner. That's not cool. Make sure everyone's on the same page from the beginning to the end. All right, well, it's 10:03 by my clock. I'm going to go ahead and call it here. Please know that if you have any questions from this point forward, send them to me in a DM, send them to Joan in a DM. You can put them in the channel. It doesn't matter. Smoke signals. I don't care. Just ask. We are here to help you. We are here to help you improve. We are here to help your team improve so that everybody can raid and get fat loots. Thank you for your time. I appreciate everyone here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gare. Nice job.
So
Thanks,
much.
Dragon.
All right.
We appreciate you too, Dragon.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to end my recording. Please, again, if you have any questions, be sure and let me know. Thank you.